Gold was once the anchor of civilization, the silent metal that chained empires to the laws of scarcity, until rulers learned they could forge wealth not from mines, but from belief, that the shimmer of trust could be melted, stretched, and stamped into paper, and that if people only believed in the promise, paper itself could shine like gold. That discovery changed the world. It built palaces, funded wars, and created a new priesthood of finance, men who understood that money's power no longer came from metal, but from memory. Once value had weight. It could clink, tarnish, or be stolen. But with the stroke of a pen, value became vapor, an entry in a ledger, a whisper of assurance that redemption was possible. The illusion was elegant. Every note a promise, every promise backed by a vault no one ever checked. For centuries, people accepted fiction because it worked. Markets flourished, trade accelerated, governments expanded their reach. Yet underneath, the same equation haunted every empire. The number of claims kept rising, while the gold that backed them did not. The Byzantines had learned this first. Their salatus was so pure that its name became synonymous with honesty. Merchants in Constantinople, Damascus, and Venice treated it as the closest thing to divine currency. For 600 years it never changed, until ambition outweighed prudence. The emperors began to dilute it, just slightly, mixing gold with base metals to stretch their resources. Each debasement bought them time, armies, monuments, and debt. At first no one noticed. The coin still gleamed, it still bore the emperor's face, but purity, once compromised, rots in silence. Within decades, merchants tested every coin, demanding higher prices or better gold. Confidence cracked like old marble. Byzantium's money, the very foundation of its trade, lost its sanctity. No invading army had breached its walls. The empire had melted its own wealth from within. 1,000 years later, kings and bankers repeated the trick, but this time with ink instead of alloy. The Bank of England, under the glow of candlelight ledgers, issued notes promising gold on demand, though it held a fraction of what it owed. Across the Atlantic, the United States did the same, transforming vaults into symbols and paper into power. The logic was irresistible. If redemption was rare, why not multiply the paper? So long as faith endured, the illusion held. That illusion became the bloodstream of modern civilization. It financed the Industrial Revolution, the building of railways, the colonization of continents. It was celebrated as progress, a victory of intellect over scarcity. Economists praised it as sophistication, a world liberated from the burden of metal. But history calls it by another name, temptation. Because every illusion needs believers, and the believers always pay the price. The moment people start to doubt, the magic dies. A rumor, a run, a whisper that redemption might not be possible, and the vault doors become walls. Banks collapse under the weight of their own promises. Governments issue decrees. Convertibility is suspended. Faith is declared obsolete. And suddenly, what was once as good as gold is only good until tomorrow morning. This is the heart of the trick, the reason it survives across millennia. It doesn't depend on alchemy or deceit. It depends on hope. Hope that the note will still buy bread, that the bond will still pay interest, that the promise will still be honored by men you will never meet. And as long as that hope exists, rulers can print wealth without mining it. The greatest resource in any empire is not its gold, its land, or its armies. It is its people's belief that the system will hold. When that belief falters, history begins again. From the Byzantine minters to the British bankers, from the Saludans to the dollar, the same sequence repeats: print, prosper, panic, collapse. Each era dresses it in a new language: credit expansion, fiscal stimulus, quantitative easing, but the essence never changes. The trick that turned paper into gold is the same one that turns stability into illusion, and behind every illusion stands the same truth: gold never leaves the earth. It only changes hands. It moves quietly, away from those who trust, toward those who see. When faith becomes currency, disbelief becomes profit. The world remembers its empires for their monuments, their generals, their conquests, but their real legacy lies in how they debased their money. Rome with its silver wash, Byzantium with its fading purity, Britain with its overissued paper, America with its promises unbacked by metal. Each believed it had outsmarted history. Each discovered that belief cannot be printed, because money is not metal, and it is not paper. It is confidence suspended in time. And once that confidence cracks, even the strongest empire finds that the gold was never in the vault, it was in the people's trust, and that trust, once lost, cannot be bought back at any price. Confidence is a strange kind of wealth. It builds slowly, invisibly, like sediment beneath an empire's foundations, until one day, it cracks all at once. And when it does, the ground that once felt unshakable turns liquid, swallowing currencies, governments, and the people who trusted them most. That is how every paper illusion ends. Not with thunder, but with disbelief. By the early 20th century, the world was drunk on paper promises. The gold standard was supposed to be a leash on greed, a contract that said every note in circulation could be redeemed for real metal. But governments learned quickly that the leash could be stretched. Wars, debts, and political ambitions demanded more money than gold could provide. The trick that began in ancient vaults was now global. The illusion of convertibility. Take Britain in 1931. For over a century, the pound had been the pride of the empire, a currency as good as gold itself. But the Great Depression turned that faith into fiction. As exports collapsed and investors demanded redemption, the Bank of England faced the oldest arithmetic in finance: more claims than gold. Ships literally sailed from London to New York, carrying bullion to meet foreign withdrawals, and every departure drained confidence further. When the vaults began to echo, the government chose survival over honesty. It suspended the gold standard. Overnight, the pound was no longer gold, it was belief, and belief had fled. Across the Atlantic, the illusion cracked again. In 1933, the United States faced its own run on trust. Americans hoarded gold, sensing the system was strained. President Franklin D. Roosevelt responded not with persuasion, but with force. Executive Order 6102 made it illegal for citizens to own gold. They were required to surrender it at a fixed price of $20.67 per ounce. Then, once the government had taken the metal, it devalued the dollar to $35 an ounce. In a single stroke, savers lost 40% of their purchasing power, robbed not by thieves in the night, but by the signature of their own president. The illusion survived, but it was wounded. From that day forward, the message was clear. When promises and gold collide, governments will always choose promises. For the next 4 decades, the world lived under a new compromise, the Bretton Woods system. Nations could no longer redeem their currencies for gold, but they could redeem them for dollars, and the dollar alone remained tied to metal. It was a beautiful hierarchy of faith. The world trusted America, and America promised the world it would never break that trust. Every country printed money, knowing it was ultimately convertible to gold through the dollar. But as global trade exploded, so did the arithmetic problem: too many dollars, not enough gold. By the late 1960s, France began demanding gold for its reserves, shipping dollars back across the Atlantic. Germany, Japan, and others quietly followed. The United States watched its vaults shrink as the rest of the world called the bluff. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on television and did what every empire eventually does. He severed the link between paper and metal. The temporary suspension of convertibility became permanent. Gold was no longer money. Paper ruled alone. That was the day the illusion stopped pretending. The trick that had begun as paper backed by gold became paper backed by confidence. The dollar was no longer a promise of metal. It was a promise of power, and for a time it worked. Freed from the discipline of gold, governments could spend, borrow, and inflate at will. Economies surged, markets boomed, and people cheered the end of constraint. They didn't realize it yet, but money had quietly changed its nature. It was no longer a measure of value, but a measure of control. Every collapse since has been a variation of that revelation. In Argentina, in 1998, a government pegged its currency to the dollar, promising that 1 peso would always equal $1. It worked, until it didn't. When reserves ran dry, the peg snapped, the currency collapsed, and millions saw their savings erased. In Asia in 1997, Thailand's baht fell first, then Indonesia's rupiah, then Korea's won, each domino linked by the same illusion, the belief that paper parity could outlast market panic. And yet, despite every failure, the trick endures. Why? Because no empire believes it's next. They all say the same words: our system is stronger. Britain said it in 1931. America said it in 1971. Every nation with a printing press has whispered it since. But the truth is colder. There is always more paper than gold, more claims than value, more promises than trust. And when that imbalance becomes visible, people don't wait for policy. They run. They sell, hoard, and flee, each person trying to be the first through a narrowing door. Confidence collapses faster than any wall, and when it does, the system consumes itself. That is the law of monetary gravity. What rises on trust must fall on truth. Every government imagines it can defy that pull. Every generation convinces itself that technology or regulation or modern economics has ended the cycle. But history is patient. It waits until belief is absolute, and then it asks the simplest question of all: where is the gold? And when the answer comes back empty, the illusion ends, not because the world stops believing in money, but because it realizes what money really is, a mirror of faith, not a store of value. When gold was finally unchained from money, the world didn't abandon the illusion. It perfected it. Because once people had accepted that value could exist without metal, governments realized that wealth itself could be created from numbers, that scarcity could be replaced by credit, and that the same faith that once backed a coin, the age of paper, gave way to the age of code, and the trick survived the transition without missing a beat. Central banks no longer pretended to hold gold for every note in circulation. Now they held confidence, measured in bonds, screens, and algorithms. In place of vault doors came balance sheets, and in place of gold bars came words: liquidity, quantitative easing, stimulus. They sound technical, almost sterile, but beneath them is the same ancient logic: print what cannot be mined, promise what cannot be kept forever, and hope the crowd never asks for redemption. In 2008, that hope nearly died. The world watched as banks once deemed immortal crumbled under the weight of their own leverage. The illusion of safety collapsed faster than the markets themselves. For a moment, trust, that invisible metal of modern finance, evaporated. People lined up outside shuttered branches. Headlines screamed too big to fail, and governments did what emperors had always done when cornered. They printed salvation. Trillions in new money flooded the system, rescuing institutions while quietly taxing savers through inflation. History didn't repeat, it rhymed with new vocabulary. 12 years later, the pattern returned under a different banner: a pandemic, a pause in trade, a world locked inside its own homes. To prevent collapse, money was conjured on a scale the ancients could never imagine. Stock markets soared while streets stood empty. Those who owned assets grew wealthier than ever. Those who owned only wages found that prices moved faster than paychecks. The lesson was ancient, but freshly learned. When value is created from nothing, it flows to those closest to the creation. Across oceans, another chapter unfolded in miniature. In Lebanon, between 2019 and 2021, banks closed their doors and froze withdrawals. Overnight, savings accounts became museum pieces, numbers trapped behind glass. The Lebanese pound lost more than 90% of its value. Families who had believed their deposits were safe discovered that balance was only a word. What survived were the things governments cannot dilute: gold coins hidden in drawers, land held outside the banking system, skills that could still produce value when paper lost its voice. Yet even in ruin, the trick evolves. Today, paper gold trades on global markets, contracts, futures, and exchange-traded funds that promise ownership of metal most investors will never see. Billions of ounces change hands each year, but if everyone demanded delivery, the vaults would run dry in days. It is the same pattern: promises outnumbering reality, wearing digital clothing. The illusion is no longer medieval or modern, it is algorithmic, and still, faith endures. Because the alternative is fear. Societies run not on gold, but on the belief that tomorrow will resemble today. That is why illusions persist. They are comfortable, elegant, profitable. But truth, as history keeps proving, does not negotiate. For those who pay attention, the pattern of survival is consistent. In Byzantium, it was gold. After the Black Death, it was liquidity. In Florence, it was distrust of too big to fail. In the Confederacy, it was food and land. In modern times, it is diversification, assets the printer cannot multiply, and skills the machine cannot replace. Wealth that endures is not what you are handed by institutions. It is what you can hold, create, or trade. When institutions tremble, that is the hidden message in every collapse. Money is not reality, it is reflection. When trust breaks, reflections shatter, and only substance remains. Gold, property, food, craftsmanship, and knowledge. These are the constants history never erases. Everything else is theater. So the question that ends every century and begins the next is the same. When the illusion cracks again, and it always does, will you be among those waiting for promises to be redeemed, or among those already holding what is real? Because collapse is not a catastrophe for everyone. For the prepared, it is transfer, from paper to metal, from symbols to substance, from the many who trust to the few who understand. And if this story has opened your eyes to how the same illusion still rules the modern world, then make sure you stay with us, because the next Financial Ripples episode will dive even deeper into how these patterns repeat, who benefits, and how you can protect what's yours before the next shock arrives. If this video gave you a new perspective, like it, share it, and subscribe to Financial Ripples. History doesn't just record the past, it warns the future. We'll be here to help you read it before it repeats.